So I just kind of called it the United Nations agendas versus sovereignty, because that's kind of where we're at. We're focused on sovereignty, but it's good to have the historical overview and to look at solutions. So my question to you, do you know where the idea of 50-minute cities comes from? And do you know how your municipality spends your tax dollars? Those are two things to keep in mind as we go through this, all right? So just a history of how Canada's municipalities became agents of the United Nations, because all our municipalities are, and they are also working on taking over the Indigenous as well, and putting them in as agents for United Nations. So it began when Canada signed on to Agenda 21 to become a UN nation state, and that was in 1992, and I believe that was under Brian Mulroney. Then there was a Commission on Global Governance publishing a paper in 1992 that I'm going to look at because it has quite an interesting definition of global governance. And then there was the production of a municipal primer on United Nations Conference on Environment and Development that was published in 1992 based on a conference that took place in 1990, or was published in 94, conference was in 92. Then we had the introduction of the Municipalities Act, and that was in 2001, and that brought about a lot of the amalgamations, regionalizations, anything that supported loss of autonomy and local governance. That was the purpose of the Municipal Act, was to bring into alignment all the, up to that point, local communities. And our mayors of our communities are now under board control and the International Council of Local and Environmental Issues, ICLEI, I think it is, or ICLEI. They were installed and are controlling things. So all these events were pretty much done by unelected or non-government entities. So I'm going to go into most of these and just talk about how they came about. I want to start with something you may or may not be aware of, which is the global governance, creating our global network. And that was established in 1992, and it was fully supported by the United Nations Secretary General. And this commission actually produced a report that was entitled Global Governance, Our Global Neighborhood. Sounds very cozy, doesn't it? So the concept of global governance, this is taken from the paper. There is no alternative to working together and using collective power to create a better world. So this is bringing together everyone. Governance is the sum of the many ways individuals and institutions, public and private, manage their common affairs. It is a continuing process through which conflicting or diverse interests may be accommodated and cooperative action may be taken. This is the part that I quite like. It includes formal institutions and regimes empowered to enforce compliance, as well as informal arrangements that people and institutions either have agreed to or perceive to be in their interest. When I was reading some of this paper, I didn't get through all of it, but for the most part, it really was around the enforcing compliance. And it was talking about the need for global, meaning get rid of local and start to really move towards one world order. This is where this was coming from. The New World Order has its little birth in, particularly in this commission paper. So then we move to 1994. The conference was from the one that was held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And it was a municipal primer on United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. And this was actually the beginning of putting forward the takeover of our municipalities, the local governments. It was co-authored, this particular primer was co-authored by two private companies, the Canadian Urban Institute and the Urban Environment Center. And It's quite interesting when you read what they are. They are basically all about how to get cities and a design of cities into moving in and everything urban. All right. So while it seemed that they were the authors of this, was because they were talking about municipalities, which they correlated to urban. So in this document, it said that this document is designed to provide municipalities and formal groupings of municipalities. Remember, this is where we started our amalgamations under the Municipals Act, and this was already in planning. With information and practical guidance on how they may contribute to the effective implementation in Canada of agreements reached at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. Both the Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities were involved in the lead up to this conference, and they helped to prepare the Canadian position as it relates to human settlements. Here we are, we're settlements, folks. Both organizations thought it would be useful and timely to move the UCID agenda forward with local governments by preparing a municipal primer on the conference and its recommendations. The primer explains the relevance of the conference and its products, such as Agenda 21, to Canadian municipalities, and explores various strategic actions that may be taken to promote sustainable development at the community level. Sounds positive, doesn't it? And that's their goal. They put everything in very positive. But take a look at the table of contents. And remember, this was in 1992, leading into publication in 1994, and totally embraced by the Canadian Federation of Municipalities. And so there was things like the United Nations Conference, and the Earth Summit was back there. Then they talked about the products, and the products were the climate change. This was when it was coming in, and that was setting the stage for where we are now. Biological diversity, so that's looking at environment again. A statement of principles on forests, and then of course Agenda 21. And then they talked about strategic actions. So what were they focusing on? Protection of the atmosphere, protection of the land, and biological diversity. Looking at poverty, health, and social equity, such as housing, access to services and information, access to employment, public awareness and information exchange. So when you look at this table of contents, you actually see what we are now experiencing. 30 years later? Quite a bit later. So this was all part of the plan. The UN 2030 agenda and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, was adopted in 2015 by all countries in the United Nations. And of course, Canada is signed right up there. It is often called a radical plan for humanity and a new way of doing development. But what do they mean by that? And here are the 5 things that you really need to know about. That the 2030 agenda, this is what they're talking about, that the 2030 agenda applies to all countries and actors. It has, and the SDGs are all interlinked, leaving no one behind, and development must be smart. If it's not risk informed, it's not sustainable, and everyone is needed. So let me translate a little bit for you. The first point, that the 2030 agenda applies to all countries and actors, it ensures that moving from the focus of underdeveloped countries, which was the previous focus, particularly in Agenda 21, when they were introducing the Sustainable Development Goals, that was really focused on the underdeveloped countries. And what this now means is that they want to start focusing on the developed countries, because remember, that's where there was a democracy, or at least there was people that were believing that they were free. And also this is where a lot of the middle class was, that was standing up and wanting to maintain their lifestyle. So it talks about bringing all them now into the fold, all right, with all nations. And they also, at that point, that was where they really started to blame the developed countries a lot for climate change, producing a desire for them to take part in this agenda due to guilt that they were trying to promote. And now when they say they're linking all the SDGs, what they're talking about there is that they're bringing them all together. They're starting to blur the lines. They're starting to have one move into the other, so that where before we might be working on some of the sustainable development goals, now they're saying they all need to be included. It's the underpinning of the New World Order, those 17 sustainable development goals. So it was really about interlinking them and moving forward without calling it the New World Order agenda. Leaving no one behind. Well, that means they just basically want to make sure that everybody's in there. And that radical new stance is designed to bring the world to all of this. And they want the world to be living life-changing zero levels. So they want zero poverty, zero hunger, zero preventable child death. And then they, of course, address AIDS, TB, malaria, and all the other diseases that they conveniently created with vaccines. And also, they mentioned human trafficking as part of leaving no one behind. And then when we look at development must be smart, what they're basically saying is that 40% of the world population was affected by disasters between 2002 and 2012. And of course, they neglect to mention how many of those disasters happened and who was behind them. But there were 12 million fatalities, at 1.2 million fatalities. And so that meant that it was risk informed. In other words, they were stepping up the fear factor, saying that there has to be risks identified in order to develop smart. If you're not aware of the high risk, you're not going to be sustainable. So again, they were integrating that fear factor into all of this. And then number 5, everyone is needed. What they're basically doing, this is where they introduce that governments and UN were not doing this alone, that they were going to bring in now the private communities, the companies, the academics, technology, financial, civil servants. They were bringing all of this together. So they were really blurring the line about the fact that in a sovereign situation, it is someone who is selected by the people to work for the people and answerable to the people. And now what they're doing is essentially neutering the government. So while those look like really good goals, if you read between the lines, they're not that great. Then we come into the 2030 agenda and a new paper that was produced. And it was a policy briefing that was given to the Canadian government as part of the good practice in 2030 agenda implementation. And this series was produced by the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation and the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. And it was funded in part by the Government of Canada's Sustainable Development Goals program, surprise, surprise, which of course are directly related to the UN. It was done in collaboration with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And if you go to their website, the first thing they say is we are a high-level political forum with which has no elected officials. In other words, they're right up front that they're working without being elected, but they're working at a political level. So, really looking at things like that, it gives you the history of where things were coming from. And in this report, there was some recommendations done at the end. And again, these recommendations were done by councils, but not elected officials, not necessarily those that we chose, not that we really choose them, they've been chosen. The recommendations were to localization must be taken into consideration. In other words, they're really promoting this partnership and localization really moving forward. And it was in their recommendation where they said they needed to do assessment of local capacity to develop. And really what they're doing is looking at overarching and inclusive applications for the developments as they head towards a single agenda, the 2030 agenda. They also said that they had to reflect Canada's 2030 agenda national strategy, and it must have all the local alignment to this strategy. The third recommendation they made was that they would support integration of the 2030 agenda into provinces, territorial municipalities, Indigenous government policies. So it was very inclusive consultation on local priorities. They were looking at human and financial constraints, using those as an opportunity to go in and say, well, we know that you can't really do this because you don't have the manpower and you don't have the money, but we'll fix that and we'll start to look at how we can remove those constraints for you. It also meant that in their consultation, they were putting priorities at the local levels that directly reflect the Agenda 2030, and that they were to align their policies, plans, and programs with that 2030 agenda. The other part of this policy paper recommendation was to support the Indigenous governments that wanted to integrate the 2030 agenda. They knew that they couldn't do it on their own, so they were going to increase their awareness of how they could be providing support for those Indigenous governments, the sovereign Indigenous governments who wanted to integrate the 2030 agenda. And we know that the bulk of that assistance would be through finance and coercion, because that is the main ways that they function. So it all looks so perfect the way they've worded it. And if you read these documents, it sounds like, oh my goodness, this is really good. But it's not. We know that. I mean, we have been awake, most of us, for a while, and we know that the United Nations is really just the front entity for the New World Order, which of course wants everything under their control with a single global government, with a single global governance. And that was first introduced to us in 1992. So what can we do to stop this takeover that seems so well orchestrated and funded? Well, it starts with you. Remember, you are powerful to the point that you standing in your sovereignty strikes fear into those who are claiming to have authority over us.